I need somebody at the microfilm here to report out the 2 or 3 most significant nuggets that the group was talking about. We have 3 to 5 minutes to do it. As you can see, it's not an easy process to get somebody up to talk, right? We could actually have you voice what the topic is. I'm sure maybe Bob is ready to do this already. If Bob, who's from the health group, so I know what the nature of the topic is here. Thank you, Kathy. Get things started, indeed.
So our discussion group talked about health, particularly public health, representatives from the university, agencies in the region, volunteers, people work with various groups. Highlights of the conversation. We detect that there's really not good systems, there are not good systems in place for spatially representing health other than at county scale, the most coarse-grained scale. So how do we somehow reconcile what's happening to people within neighborhoods, within communities, with the methodologies by which public health data are now collected and displayed? Let's see. Despite those challenges, there are a lot of opportunities for engaging people in health-producing behavior, be it disease prevention or be it general wellness. So one example is one of our team members is working with the university to create a health app or a wellness app. So in addition to physical mapping of the physical facilities of all the campus, there's going to be a layer of facilities and suggestions about how one can engage in wellness behavior. So for instance, if you are considering bike commuting, where are the showers? Where are the public showers located around campus? Where are the good food sources? Where are the good snacks? Things like that. So provider locations. Another opportunity that was mentioned is graphic format for communications. We are becoming an ever more, we want the most efficient representation of things, and often graphics are better than words for that purpose. So by using maps, color, labeling, icons, we can quickly convey information about health behavior and where health facilities are available. Anything else?
Is there another group that is ready? Mike? David? Any other group ready?
So we discussed the integration of BIM content, building information modeling, SIM content, civil information modeling, and GIS, on how there are benefits to be gained by the integration of those data sources for a true common operating picture of existing or planned conditions. But there are challenges, both graphical formats, of which they might share some in common, but also from an infrastructure of information. So we recognize the importance of being able to integrate these various data sources. But once we achieve that, there's tremendous value, and we hear in the business world about data mining. That's a big term in the news right now, data mining. We can do geospatial data mining through this infrastructure. And frankly, as I mentioned earlier, it comes down to minimizing risk on specifically to engineering projects. why BIM has been successful, minimizing risk of the unknown once we start construction. With SIM, we're minimizing risk of finding buried content that then impacts our design for utility systems. And frankly, with GIS, huge part of geodesign, what is there and what can we do with it? We minimize risk on projects. How can we bring all this together? And there is value in perhaps reallocating funds, in particular from a facilities design and construction perspective. We can take some money from contingency funds and pour it into enhanced surveys at the design of at the start of a project to give us truly 3D surveys, surface and surface content. There's no reason why we can't do that. Let's model the surface and subsurface world. And we heard the discussion of there's value. There's value in graphics, and yes, there is. But I'm a proponent for that third dimension. If I can get it in 3D, oh my goodness, there is a third dimension there that provides a tremendous amount of information that I didn't have before. 3D isn't always the best format, but it should be applied where it makes most sense. And this is where I'm really excited about where I see the technology going. I see GIS embracing more 3D content. Yes, it's about time. But we still have some challenges ahead with, frankly, one discussion we had was existing management of campuses, cities, military installations, counties are sometimes reluctant to move out in these areas due to being unfamiliar with the technology and standards in place. Good summary, I think? Yeah.
Okay, well, I have two challenges. One is getting stuff from Mike's really big brain through to something that I can relate to you. And it's hard for me to do it in American because I speak English, so I'm sorry about that. All right, so we discussed a number of things, and it started off with, I should say that the original focus was tools and the kind of stuff that Mike talked about earlier, and how do we integrate these things, interoperability and what have you. And sort of related to that, first thing we talked about was really barriers to entry. So the question, I guess, is, and the hypothesis, is there a risk that geodesign, as we've seen it described here, as it's talked about in Esri conferences and all that sort of thing, is something of an elite practice, or could be, because it's just too hard to get this stuff into the life of a GIS person, that, especially in a local authority where they're dealing with all sorts of budget cuts and everything, and they're just struggling to do the more mundane stuff of maintaining their geometry and things. So, if your life is just full of working with, I think it was John Owen who said earlier about the geometry and the attributes, how do you ever get to the sketching? Because you just don't have time for it. And so that relates to a bit of a discussion we had on education. And so Tabar, for example, is teaching at a community college there, and if he's got 2 years and he's trying to balance the needs of that GIS world and that GIS reality, how does he then start thinking about geodesign in a way that is valuable to the outside world? Where does it fit in? Because, we obviously appreciate the value of it here, but how do you get down to the ground to something that, something can learn in a couple of years along with everything else and then get a job? So, one of the suggestions there that Mike had made has to do with starting as, you could use geodesign and related things as a broad way of looking at the world, and then use that to sort of focus down on the certain interests and specific interests of certain people, whether it be hydrology, environment, political, geographical things, or what have you, and then work back out again and bring it all back together. You see what I mean? It's sort of like an hourglass type thing, So you can see geodesign as an integrating framework for education in that respect. And then this last one here, I'm going to introduce a word here that I'd never heard of. And if I sound really clever, it's my word. If I don't, it's Bryant's word. Okay. So how do we develop a praxis? Has anyone heard of that word before? Really? It's an academic thing, isn't it? There we go. Okay. All right, it's his word. So how do we develop a praxis? A praxis apparently is a practical application of knowledge. So it's sort of just getting all the ideas together and doing something with it, I suppose. Is that right, Brian? Yeah. Okay, good. Really, how do we do that? Through university private sector collaboration. So that kind of gets to what I was saying a few minutes ago about, is this a bit of an elite, nice discussion to have? What's the practical reality, for the real world? And how do you get the knowledge together in such a way that it can be applied? How's that, Brian? Will that do? Yeah. So there we go. That's all we got. Thank you. Any questions on that? Is that good for the report?
Okay, so I think I talked a little too much. We were generally talking about environmental data within the with the geodesign paradigm, within that paradigm, and I really started talking about Deepwater Horizon, which has kind of consumed my life, and Nick's as well. We initially responded to oil spill and have been working on collecting and managing and working on the analysis for the natural resource damage assessment, which has really taken us to places that we had never been before in terms of really needing data standards and the ability to compile information from across the spectrum. So typically you're looking at environmental contaminants, and that's what you're looking at. You may bring in some other GIS data and some other, you may have an engineer, maybe a biologist, but we were really forced to integrate all different types of data. We had really an aha, we call it actually, our suspended tape, like our oh shit moment, when we realized we had information from, we had photographs, we had observations of cetaceans, we had oil in marshes, and we had no way to ask any questions in a unified way, so we were splintering. So we really borrowed some ideas from the big data environment, and we really were able to pull together this information. So we were, in our group, discussing the need for data standards compilation in an environment where you're not just uploading a packet of information that's disconnected. It's not just metadata describing what you have, but it's actually getting down to the brass tacks to this is what this field means, ontology, controlled vocabulary type of library science concepts. And from a geodesign perspective, needing to look at that information and collaboratively design studies. When you're doing things over time, if you just take your data and put it away, you really don't have that ability to ask questions and have the different disciplines come together and really provide input and feedback on what's important to them. So that's been facilitated by desktop GIS and some web viewers, but there's, I think, really an opportunity to do more without getting into some of the groups that are pushing that envelope. I think there's still a lot to be done. And then a collaborative environment for sharing and accessing that data. So once you've collected information, done the hard work to put it together, how do you get it back out to the scientists and to the people who need to take that information and make decisions, communicate it to others? And I know this is a common theme that is part of some of the other presentations. And then a collaborative environment, maybe part of the continuum, for aggregating that value-added information. So if you've collected raw data, you queried it out, so you've asked some questions, filtered, and then you have gone through and done some analysis. Perhaps it's a resource valuation or habitat equivalency analysis or some delineations, and you've done this perhaps disconnected. How do you take that and bring it back together so you can tell the full story of here's what we had, here's what we pulled out, here's what we did to really make decisions, to do analysis, to add our professional judgment and also our model results. How do you bring that back together into an environment where you can ask further questions and you can do what-if scenarios? So anyway, this is some of the things we were talking about that we struggle with and that we're making some inroads in, and I think some of the concepts that were discussed here will inform what we're doing in the future. And then of course there's a resolution, a scale issue of how many players are involved, how much can you drive the ship or how much are you just hanging on by your fingernails. So, I think that's thanks.
Discussion follows nicely with the previous group. We started out with kind of a more focused discussion about some of the tools that Rob's presentation went over, sort of that framework to help this collaborative process function, and got into a little bit more detail about how different organizations of different sizes, different jurisdictions might implement those sorts of tools to make sound decisions across, when it comes to dealing with different parties, different stakeholders. How do you all collaborate effectively? Basically, it kept boiling down into communication skills, being able to communicate properly. So a lot of our discussion was spent just talking about ways in which we communicate and ways in which we fail to communicate. Specifically related to some of those kinds of tools and this web-based environments that we might be able to work in. We talked a little bit about some of the pitfalls of implementing those kinds of products, because I think the conclusion was drawn about healthcare.gov. Plan accordingly, because if it fails out of the gates, you may not get a second chance to use that sort of technology or those sorts of tools. While those tools are great, and if they're designed properly, they can be implemented and used to the benefit of a lot of different people. If they fail immediately, you may not get a second chance. Those are just a few of the topics we discussed. I think a whole lot more topics that went off in a lot of different directions, but yeah, that was the keys.
Nice song. And Robert, did you have any discussion to report out?
So we were a small group, so just 3 of us over there, and Bill left, and Nasong didn't want to do it, so I guess that's me. So I asked Bill to basically describe geodesign, and he drew this. So this is on the back of a napkin. We kind of focused on 3 questions, and I want to thank Bill for indulging me, because I kind of feel like he was driving the car, and he was my grandfather, and I'm sitting in the back seat, and I keep asking all these questions, like why is the sky blue? And in fact, at one point we stopped and he asked me, but you know this, right? I said, no, I really don't. So we had 3 questions, or I asked him 3 questions. One was, what's the value of operations research? Because he talked about that. Second, why model? Why are we modeling? And he gave me a nice answer for that. And then the third one was, what is geodesign? And so I think at the point at which he drew the napkin, then I had a nice discussion about the 6 steps. Was I kept focusing on why you have to go through it forwards and then backwards and then forwards again. So we didn't talk about this. I think this was brought up during your presentation, Mary. We had no introduction to the 6 phases. So Bill mentioned that at first he had come up with 50 tasks, and then he got it down to 25, like an actual sequence of things you do, and that sort of seemed like what Steinitz had done. The 6 phases. So I was trying to figure out, okay, you're going backwards and forwards and forwards and backwards. What I got out of it was that it's sort of the answer to why model, because it forces you to think about what you want to do before you design anything. So there are some systems that are too costly to mess with or trifle with, and that's why you would model, because it's cost avoidance. You create a model first, you mess with it, play with it, mess around with it, destroy it, or whatever, inside of a computer first, before you try to do anything on the ground. It's supposed to be cheaper that way, I guess. The other reason that you model is because, again, it forces you to think about your system. So basically, I think I've got it, in part. Geodesign, it forces you to go back and forth and back and forth. Data collection should be maybe one of the last things that you do. Bill was nice enough to explain sort of like a story, as I'm sitting in the back seat, saying, well, it's like when you have a client, you think about what you're delivering to the client first, and you think, well, what do I have to do to deliver that product, and what do I have to do to deliver that product before that, and you're working backwards. So I think that's the explanation for why geodesign goes backwards. I want to add one last thing. So we started with intention and intervention. I'm wondering about what if my intentions are different than yours. So, Brian, let's say we have a vision of the world. I want the world where Kansas State wins the national championship every year, where single malt scotch falls like manna from the sky, and where everyone has to wear a cowboy hat on their LinkedIn photo. So we agree on that. But what if there's a difference between what's feasible? I'm focusing on what's feasible. Somebody else focuses on what's preferred, and someone else yet focuses on what's most resilient. So I guess the question I'll leave us with is, does geodesign help that conflict between the social actors? You have to come up with some alternative at the end. How do you balance those things? I'm going to guess and take it on faith that forcing yourself to think about this state space within which a design might emerge first before you do anything might help people to compromise on what's feasible, what's preferred, what's resilient and sustainable.
The Ross table.
So our table really focused on geodesign or organodesign, which is one of the things that came up in John's presentation. And so we talked a bit about sort of the difference between those and a bit about institutional development and organizational development and how technology is used in those organizations. And we talked a bit about careers, just kind of focusing on student development and that sort of thing. And how, I guess, in the career topic, in developing your course of study and what you want to do, going into GIS and sort of technology and that sort of thing can be all encompassing, but just to be aware that when you get out in the field in your career, you might have a challenge moving to project manager or supervisory positions in some cases. So that was one thing we talked about, because technology, and John brought up a good point that, before it may not have been sort of spatial technologies, may not have been sort of all encompassing, changing so quickly that you could sort of keep a handle on it, and then still develop a career and become, diverse in other aspects of your course of study. But now everything's changing so much that you could spend, every day just trying to stay on top of things. So that was one of the things that came up. We also talked a bit about how to actually do geodesign, sort of been looking at a structure of an organization. You might have a GIS shop. You might have sort of subject matter experts, hydrologists, biologists, and sort of who does geodesign in those two groups. And one of the things we came up with, what John was suggesting, was that it can be done with diverse teams. So maybe a small team that's diverse in their specialty, like a small organization, small teams, be a good way to do it. And the bigger organizations, it's just harder to move things forward in a big organization. And we also discussed in terms of GIS and mapping and geodesign, how to get across messages and how to have those conversations with people so your messages can come across to a broader audience for technical information, and the fact that storytelling and getting good at doing storytelling with your maps, with your data, is an important part of the process too, and getting that out to people. And that skill may not reside in your organization also, and sometimes consulting companies are where you can do sort of more marketing or targeting your information. Am I missing anything? I think that was about all. Let's see. Yeah, and I think just back to I guess wrapping up with the course of study is trying to figure out a way for when you're more in the technical aspect of things, what's the role for a geodesign person to be in sort of a project management role, how can that advance in our different fields so we get the more integrated sort of social, institutional, as well as data, GIS side of things bridged in organizations.
Thank you. And the last group?
I wish there were two of me so I could have sat at that last table, because I think coming from an institutional perspective, it would have been helpful to be in on that conversation about how technology is used in classes. We talked a lot about WAGDA 1.0 and its outdatedness in the downloading of zip files. The Washington Geospatial Data Archive that's hosted by the libraries here on campus. We did talk a little bit about how WAGDA 2.0, which is a redesigned website, should be going live, I'll say, this quarter, just to be on the safe side. And that will have better links to data, and it sounded like students will appreciate that they're not actually having to download zip files and go from page to page to page to find metadata. Hopefully it will all be in one place and be more cohesive. For me, one of the takeaways was that the students that were speaking with us aren't using WAGDA in the way that I necessarily thought they were. You know, we thought it was great. We were coming up with this direct connect technology where they could just save data in their math documents, but they're just downloading it and clipping it and processing it anyways. And so that was informative to me as an IT person. We also talked about what data is useful for students, and it might not be some of the data that we're providing. So we might think about providing more curated links to data that might inform geodesign. So I think that's something for us to look forward in the future. I think that's about it. We talked about some very specific data sets and data needs that some of the students had. Is that it?
Okay, so there were a number of different ideas coming out, obviously, and so what I'd like each of the groups to do is to identify perhaps another group's report out, and essentially Allison there kind of led me into the idea there. She wanted to be in this other group, as it would be, which means that there's a connection between the two groups, and I well know what the connection really is between those two groups, because it was the 24 CDs that the city of Seattle sent me in 1995 that I gave to the libraries that became the Washington Geospatial Data Archive, because I didn't want to, as a faculty member, distribute to all campus those 24 CDs on a checkout basis. It lasted for 2 months. I gave up, and the libraries happily took it. So there are perhaps some ideas that are cross-fertilization ideas, let us say, between what the group here on the nature of maybe architectures, if I cast it that way, and the nature of maybe emergency response, in terms of what are the connections between two groups, that if we had to take a next step as a next thought kind of a thing, where would we go with that idea? So any pairwise of any two groups, does anybody need any help with, well, actually you just need one other group, so something resonated with you, hopefully, from your perspective to some other group perspective.
So I didn't actually sit in on Rob's group because I was talking specifically with Nancy and Jeff about how to potentially use the SPT within the ROS project for decision-making and collaboration. And so that connects me to the NOAA, your things of how do we take all this different data, and data standards are important and so on and so forth, but it's also important to not necessarily have to integrate it in the back end, but only on the front end. So you, the human, does the integration in your head, and you have a space to do that. And that, I think, is where the CSF can be valuable. You can integrate it if you need a really complex model, right, that has all the data in it, and it draws from it, and it all has to be in a certain format. but sometimes we don't need that. And I think the WAS example, the watershed example, they said, we had all these paper maps, and we sat around the table and we talked about it, and we talked about the information we had, and we did that in a small group, in-person process. But I think where we were going with the SPT as a collaboration tool and a structured discussion tool to get to decisions and to rank things and to prioritize things within an analytic environment that is designed using something like the CSF that brings together all kinds of information and does it either tightly integrated or loosely, and just in the glass, on the glass. So to me, that was a connection. Is you're saying we have all this and we're trying to solve this problem, and how do we do that? Bring it together, distill it, get it back out, get input, and I think that those questions that you're asking are creating the kind of what do we need to be able to do as tool makers? What do we need to be able to provide? And I think the direction that we're working on, and it's that definitely I think in that research category that Mike mentioned still, but we are moving forward with that. And we need good case studies. We need people like Noah that says, we really want to try this out. And actually, Voicing Climate Concerns came, which is the precursor to the Structured Participation Toolkit, came out of a NOAA grant, Voicing Climate Concerns on the Oregon coast. So that, yeah, I see a lot of opportunity there and moving forward in a very rich way, not just I can draw a rectangle on a box where I can even procedurally generate the city, which is awesome. But, okay, and I can look at some indicators, but how do I provide that in the web scene as a good option? Provide that into a web environment that we've done with the CSF that has a collaboration piece to it too. So I see a lot of potential in kind of bringing together all of the conversations that I felt like I couldn't get out in our 15-minute presentation. So I hope I've made that point now of making the connection between the tools and the users essentially who need those tools. So thanks for that. And Mike, I felt like your talk really framed that really nicely, the needs.
I actually forgot one thing earlier, so but it turns out that it's a fairly useful thing for connecting us to a group, I think, and that is how do you reconcile the tools that are available and up and coming, what have you, with strategies for actually getting stuff done, and ultimately that relates to funding, because so many places don't have enough money, and so they need an incentive to do something. So what we were talking about was really how do you relate geo-design to something that touches a nerve, and risk is always a good example. So if there is some situation where there's a risk assessment being done, defining that correctly, then there is a case that, well, for regulatory reasons or what have you. Do you say regulatory or do you say regulatory? Okay, sorry. I'm doing my best here, You'd think I'd know by now. Anyway, for regulatory reasons, you have to do something, and so you got no choice. Well, there's a case for, well, here we have these tools, but for the reasons that the gentleman over here said, you have to kind of get it right, otherwise you're not going to get a shot at this later. So, and also related to that, how can you do some kind of return on investment, some ROI analysis on a small scale to be able to justify and say, well, look, here's the cost of, in Mike's words, here's the cost of doing something right, and here's the cost of doing something really bad, which is kind of what's happening now in a lot of cases. So how do you reconcile those two things? And then on a different note, these guys produced a very clever diagram, and that's all I'm saying, because I don't know any more. In terms of who we'd like to link with, who are the communication people? Was it over here? Oh, it was you guys. Okay. It seems like what I just said there is really a marketing job as much as anything. It's an analysis, an economic analysis, a marketing job, and it relates to making your case. Does that fit what you were saying? Mm. So, given what I just said then and what you just said, Rob, is it? Yeah, okay. Who else do we relate to, if anybody, you know? Nobody. We're on our own. Sorry. Oh, forget it then.
I was just going to mention to the last point, I mean, it's quite clear from this group that we have a kind of degree of in-reach versus outreach, to add a new word to the praxis category. So in-reach, basically, you know, this community needs to be convinced of the value and the appropriate opportunities to apply geodesign. If it's something bolted onto GIS, it's something new. And then this diagram, to explain it slightly further, was just, this was Brian's impressive from memory version of Carl Steinitz's framework for geodesign that is basically a full book. So he was trying to get it down to a napkin sketch, but it appeared correct. I don't know how to summarize this briefly, but basically Carl Steinitz identified about a 6-step method which he asserts is applicable to all geodesign problems. And it runs through basically how do relevant systems work. That's done by representing those systems inside a digital computer, so they're representation models. Then there are process models that explain how processes work. Again, have to be digital. And there's an evaluation model layer. Sorry, that's the third box. Need an overhead. And evaluations are subjective, right? So if a process model is erosion, an evaluation model is that too much erosion, right? So erosion models are normative. They're not science. They're community values, but they can be applied to science. And that's the 3 steps that involve basically systems description. And then in his framework, there's another set of 3 steps that I characterize as what changes are possible and which are desirable. And so that includes change modeling. We talked about urban growth modeling earlier, and sketching, 2 forms of change modeling. That has to have a digital side, right? Got to have a way to bring ideas into the computer about things different than inventory or current systems. And then we've all talked about, many speakers, impact modeling. So you have some change condition, you're going to try and figure out what that means on one system or to multiple systems. And then finally, in his hierarchy, there are decision models. So that's, given all of that information, how are you going to decide? And if Carl were presented, he would have presented that backwards and said, start with the decision, work backwards to figure out what impacts people are worried about, work backwards from that to figure out what changes need to be on the table to deal with those impacts, work backwards from that and figure out how are you going to tell whether a process is occurring, a process that is occurring is working well or not, work backwards from that to what processes you need to model, and all the way back at the end of the chain, figure out what data it is you need to feed this little monster. So that's my summary, apologetically on the spot of Carl's framework, but just for those of you who haven't seen it.
A question that I struggle with, and I'm kind of new to geodesign. I'm a civil engineer with a GIS, physical scientist background, but oftentimes we find ourselves just running headlong, and we get to where we're going because that's how we do things, and I have been stopping and saying, well, the data that we collected and the way that we've managed and the analysis we've done, it doesn't. We're not able to answer the question that you now have. You didn't ask us, or we didn't ask the right question up front, which would have impacted the information we collected, how we managed it, and how we were querying and presenting it. So this type of approach doesn't, in the environmental data, I think that there's definitely an analog. It's not exact. I think that there are some parts that are different from a built environment and from a more of a landscape level thing. So it's maybe at a different scale, but it's still some of the same questions where you're trying to look at, well, where are we trying to get to? And let's look at that first. And then let's work back to the types of questions, the type of modeling, the type of data that we're going to need to support that decision. So that's really, and I don't know if it would fly in the world that I'm in to actually say, hey guys, we're going to do geodesign now. They'd probably stare blankly. But I think from the team that is really tasked with the data collection and the spatial, the geographically based, where all that data intersects, could really benefit from taking some of these concepts and thinking about them deeply and trying to apply them to really the whole continuum of what we're doing.
I wish I could have joined the database group as well. I think what you were saying about what's relevant and how data is collected, there's always this kind of trade-off between getting an exhaustive data set and getting a relevant data set. And I think hopefully there's ways that we can think about database design too, where we're not burdened with making an exhaustive data set, but one that's functional. And I'm thinking of damages or risk, like that landslide that just happened this year. So how can we get things like that into a database where we can see what is the risk of building on questionable land without cataloging every single ridge in the state of Washington as these things come up, and how can we comb, the popular press to get these anecdotes and get these numbers? I think that's something I like about Earth Economic System is we do benefit transfer. So we know that we can't possibly fund primary data collection on the 21 ecosystem services for every square mile in the country. So the way we have our database designed is that we can, what's a wetland worth? Well, maybe someone has done wetland studies in Wisconsin, and that information is still useful to some degree. So and I know that that's how the private sector works too. If a coal power plant is up for sale this year, how much is it worth? You may have to look far afield in other countries by other metrics. And so I'm just thinking geodesign, sometimes we get really bogged down in the place where we're at without recognizing the fact that what's going on in the place where we are happens in other places, or even the stages temporally we can see into the future by looking far afield in other places. So just a thought.
So you're a civil engineer, right? And I have been kind of on and thank you for coming, first of all, because my job was to make this be a success by reaching out to people like you. So I'm glad my spam got there and had some success. One of the things that I actually asked Carl after he taught the framework class on geodesign last summer was something that I've struggled with my whole career, and that has been the idea, and he actually pointed it out in the book, of the somewhat tenuous relationship between folks who come from the geographically oriented sciences and those who are trained from the design profession side of things. And so I've struggled with this quite a bit. In my own family, with my brother and my dad both being engineers, my dad is mechanical, my brother is civil, this is accuracy and spatial accuracy standards and the need for information and all that sort of comes up at the Thanksgiving turkey table on occasion. And we don't necessarily see eye to eye, but to Robert's point, we can start to talk the same language when we understand the semantics of what we're talking about. And that's when I brought up the term praxis, that's what I really mean, because Carl also points out that if you can't communicate on a geodesign team, which is something we haven't really talked about here in terms of people have danced around working together and what it takes to really work together as humans. And I know for me, I travel in other countries, and if I don't speak the language, it's just it's really, really hard. But then when you get somewhere and you can have some basis, like a bathroom or a beer, to talk about, then all of a sudden things start to happen with that. So the idea of the geographical oriented sciences and design professions, I asked Carl, how do you accomplish that? He said, choose problems that exist at scales that the design professions and the geographical oriented sciences are both involved. And he actually articulates that between between 1 to 5,000 and 1 to a quarter of a million. Okay, in terms of the geographic scale. Now you get the temporal scale to take into account. So, keep in mind that, and then actually he pointed out, if you choose the right scale to attack the problem, you might have a chance of actually addressing that problem. So realize that's not a panacea, that's not the keystone, but keep that in mind for us as we think about geodesign and what it may even mean on this campus as it relates to how we're trained from the design profession and from the geographic learning sciences. There's two different places, but I think we're going to have to meet in the middle on scales of overlapping collaboration.
Just a little different thought on the same theme, and a number of the presentations and our discussion this afternoon had to do with really delivering sort of technical, rational information. And it might be map-based, it might be metrics, it might be indicators, it might be a model. And this is rather anecdotal, but I kind of think about communities and their response to planning and design and how people break out into three groups when it comes to delivery of science information. The first is, great, bring it on. I need this to support decisions and policy. And there were a number of mentions in the presentations today about decision makers and policy makers. And there are those who seek this sort of information and this sort of representation of the world. The second group is, wow, I didn't know about that. Lack of awareness. They're not even aware that these tools are possible, what they represent, what they bring to a decision process. And the third, I think, is becoming more common and really alarms me, and that is denial. Those who look at modeling numbers, statistics, and say, "No, I don't buy it. I'm basing my decision on other values." So it seems that often in the public arena, as we present this sort of information, we work with teams to think about those stakeholders that may not be involved by choice or just by convenience and efficiency of getting this work done. What other stories might we wrap around these spatial portrayals of place and decisions and consequences? And you might be thinking, well, that's not my bailiwick, that's not really what I do. But I'll just harken back to the presentation I did earlier today. And the Puget Sound Partnership has really relied on an evidence-based approach to Puget Sound recovery. And there's been over a decade, I understand, of very good science and action and policy in response to that. And frankly, there's some murmurings now of, we're not making a difference. We have the metrics, we have the indicators, but we're not seeing that recovery in the sound by a number of measures, indicator species, water quality, a number of things. So what are the other stories that we wrap around data, spatial representation, that bring more people on board to do the right thing? Just a thought.
There were several groups that resonated with our discussion. Robert, far back there. Yes, we talked about modeling. Why? Yes, there's value in that. Mitigating risk, very important. The issue of you roll something out, you got to get it right the first time. Been there, done that. Didn't work out so well. I had customers coming to me for survey data, and I thought, let me just put out some system where they can go find it themselves. Great idea, but the interface was clunky, not intuitive, and they stopped using it. So I'm trying round two, but the lessons learned. How you present the data and make it accessible to users is just as important as to whether it is accurate or comprehensive or current. Just as important. But what intrigues me the most is the issue of communication. And to be very blunt, I have struggled with understanding what geodesign means. Bryant somehow found me on LinkedIn. He's like, you got to see this. You got to see this. And I'm looking through it. I'm seeing GIS, 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 GIS. I'm like, okay. And then I see BIM pops into the equation. I'm like, okay, well, that's a twist I wasn't expecting. But then today I hear geo means geographic versus geospatial. And I think it's very important that we identify what exactly we're talking about. Because if you tell me geographic, that's going to knock out SIM and BIM for me. Because for me, geospatial is GIS, the broader spectrum of information and types of data, and civil information modeling, and field information modeling, because those three data sources have common data attributes. Number one, they all know their place in the world. In BIM, that wall knows where in the world it is. In SIM, that fire hydrant knows where in the world it is. Just in GIS, that tree knows its place in the world. They also have properties. In BIM, the wall knows what kind of wall it is. It knows whether it's concrete masonry unit or steel stud. It's fire rating. In SIM, that pipe knows that it is a water pipe and its size. In GIS, that line knows it represents a fence. They have common property set. The third piece is they understand relationships. For example, in BIM, if in my design, if I move that wall in BIM, those doors attached to the wall also go with it. They understand relationships, parent-child relationships. Those three things are common across BIM, SIM, and GIS. So to be very frank, I'm confused today that when you talk about geodesign, which are you going to do? Geographic or geospatial? I'd like to hear that answer.
Thanks, Steve. This is a conversation I have with my colleague Andres Skupin at San Diego State University, who is an instructor in the Department of Geography and a phenomenon in terms of visualization. There's probably only maybe one or two other people in the world who do better at visualization than this individual does. The other one is Katie Borner, where he learned some of his stuff from. She does the Web of the World, Knowledge of the World at, she's a computer scientist at Indiana University. So a lot there. So his problem is that he's a geographer. That's his problem. He doesn't want to give up the geography aspect of it. Whereas me, when I do GIS, I truly do mean geospatial. I was a former member of the technical committee for the National Spatial Data Standards as a young person at age 32. Got in charge of this big committee, as it would be for National Data Standards, only because my PhD supervisor was the chair of the committee. Obviously, he's going to take his next best PhD student. And we learned that U.S. Geological Survey has a much larger geological unit than it does geography unit. And they actually have a much larger water resource unit by far than the geologic unit. And it's on their behalf that they created geospatial. That's why the federal government and the Federal Geographic Data Committee, they still go by that name, but have adopted geospatial as the word. So when we deal with the geo thing, it actually is the geospatial, not really the geographic, unless you're talking to a geographer. And when you're talking to a geographer, then the geographer wants to know that, is my term geographic information systems still safe? Because the surveyors in 1987 tried to hijack it to make it land information systems. I mean, literally, they tried to do that and fought for years and then finally gave up. So it is what is. It is geo. What it is you make of it, it is four-dimensional or hyperdimensional, as the case would be. But I want to come back to Bryant's issue on the 6 phases. So how many of you remember there were actually 6 phases in that modeling framework that Steinitz created? Not everybody, right? And if today was the first time you heard that, it would be a challenge. It would be for me, for sure. But I would ask the question then, well, of those 6 phases, 6 types of models, as the case would be, which is actually the most relevant? Which one can you absolutely not do without? And if you only had one to do to start with, because you got to start someplace, right? We all start someplace in the world. So which one would we start with if indeed, according to Mary, it's messy? According to Carl, it's messy. So you can do any of them, really. Any of those 18 phases, because it's 3 passes, 6 models. There's 18 different things to do, but do any of it and start someplace. Where would one start? So you might think that's a rhetorical question, but it's not, simply because I'd like to ask that question. Never asked that question really in public, and it was because only when Jesse Reynolds, who master's student in urban design and planning, came to talk to me about, well, which of these phases should I do in my master's thesis? And Jesse's about 3 months to go in the master's project, right? Something like 4 months, 5 months? Not all the time in the world, as the case would be. Like Ben, you said, well, how many of these models can you do, right? So he asked the question, well, which one do you do? Well, can you do GIS without a database? Can you do GIS without representation? So if you can, then you don't need geodesign at all. So representation is critical. And what do most people do, let us say, when it comes to be about 3:30 bottom line here? You're going to make a decision to leave or not. So that's why I asked the question rhetorically. Do we get up in the morning or not? You make a decision is what it is. We make decisions all of the time. So that's probably the second most important one. And it wasn't until 4 months ago, even though I identified the geodesign framework 15 years ago and had an opportunity to talk to Carl about that. And it seems like the 2 of us were doing that with his graduate students. And Mike, thank you very much for sticking in there as long as you didn't do the thing with Carl to show that there's a different perspective on the world than Carl. Because when you meet Carl, there's only one perspective on the world. That's Carl's perspective on the world, is what it is. So representation and decisions. Absolutely, absolutely. And we can do that now, right? Do we need any of that framework? Because GIS does, and it has been for years. Maps, hundreds of years, not thousands of years. People build a representation of the world, they make a decision. On a napkin, as the case would be, right, Robert? You can do that on a napkin. So at this point, because what I wanted to do actually was get us to 3 o'clock. So we're at 3 o'clock at this point, and on the schedule it says next steps, as the case would be. But just before we get there, I want to ask, were there any other synthesis thoughts about crossover between one group and another group for an idea to come out? I didn't realize that, Mike, I didn't realize that, Steve, you're going to set that up for me so well. Mike. Grand Canyon.
I started at 5 in the morning yesterday to come meet you guys, and it was very motivational because I knew that if I didn't make the one flight out of the Grand Canyon, there wasn't going to be another one. So if I'm hobbling, I apologize. But I wanted to riff a little bit on Steve's question because to me it's a good opportunity to talk about some of the, deduct Tim's harder one because I don't want to split the six-part baby. The relationship between different professional representations and modeling systems. If you call a BIM a modeling system, it's not really any instance of software. Strikes me as one of the places that geodesign does need to work. And I'll skip the semantic question for a moment. I do think we're talking about geospatial very broadly, with no apology to the geographers. It's not saying geography is unimportant. It's saying socioeconomics is equally important. We have a variety of different disciplines that are creating their own intelligent modeling systems, or IMS, right? And it shouldn't be accidental. You know, we've all gotten, and this ties back to the framework, but we've all gotten past inventory. For the first 35 years of computing, you were lucky to get an inventory. You're really lucky if it was current. And you spent 99% of your budget getting a current inventory. A lot of us now, and most of my students when I was at MIT, had the luxury of an incredible amount of data that had been collected, was being collected. A lot of the classic inventory stuff, it's not that it's not high value, it's not that it's not important, but we, at least in the US, have the luxury of a lot of that having been done, and that part of it that doesn't change frequently is even almost current. So we can get pretty good terrain data, etc. When we're dealing with the interface between design system and natural systems, we are really having to go in both directions. We have to create information systems like BIM that literally know each part. And as soon as that model gets released into the world and the building gets built, the way I like to think about it is when you design these windows in CAD, each pane of glass is identical. And each piece can be identical until the moment when it's built. As soon as it's built, it's in the real world. And some of that glass is getting high heat exposure. Some of it is on a north-facing side and gets ice. All of a sudden, they're individual instances that have their own life in the universe. And facilities managers actually have to track the fact that windows go out on one side of the building differently than others. So in the real world, there's a transition in the modeling that's needed to design a system and to maintain it long term. And that's part of what has led to BIM and its popularity, is that the people buying buildings started to realize that even to maintain them appropriately, they needed originally a copy of the plan as built, quote unquote, and then they realized that was a pretty clunky way of getting this rich information set that the builders and designers had actually created, thrown away, or created and then printed 2% on paper and statically. And so they saw the value of carrying the information through. I think on the natural systems side, that realization is coming more slowly, that we need to track things over time. I'm old enough that I remember being really happy to get a single Landsat scene for a single time and be able to classify it and do a study. And I work with a guy now from Pictometry who's got 80 aircraft in the air at all times, gathering oblique imagery from every place in the country. So the data circumstance really has changed. And in the natural systems side, we've done a lot of snapshot studies because that's all we were funded to do historically. There's an increasing opportunity to do long-term change detection, tracking, and monitoring, but there isn't a lot of social infrastructure supporting that yet. So it goes back to the decision-making context question, but I was last week at the state of Maryland talking to them about their governor's sustainability planning, and they not only did 20-year targets, they broke them down into 2-year increments and started holding people accountable to progress towards goals. And they kind of called us in 6 months before the first deadline in a crisis because they weren't happy with their internal initial monitoring. And gets back to a prior speaker. I mean, they were doing a lot of efforts to try and improve the environment in Maryland, but it wasn't having a lot of effect. And one of the things that was odd was that administratively they thought they were measuring how many dollars they spent and how many people, resources, and how many projects they did. They had all these internal metrics basically of churn, and they had no geospatial information about where these projects were occurring, what context they were put in. So, you imagine you're fixing a sewer system in downtown Baltimore. You expect that to clean up the bay, you're crazy. I mean, yes, it's a problem, but the scale of the solution is not making up for 100 years of history. So the challenge is that we have a lot of administrative data coming down the pike, frequently now in GIS format. It's an opportunity also because we can get a lot of information from it. But one of the contributions of geodesign is that it does provide a framework for integrating administrative data, natural systems data, and yes, building information and civil models. But it is not a full conversation yet, and I think that's part of what you're bringing to it. Because of the professional separations that are kind of famous in our field, we haven't seen a lot of, for instance, GIS analysis done with civil models. Those civil models have better data, frankly, than a lot of GIS data, right? So we should be using that stuff. But entirely for really historic reasons of professional separation, there's no linkage. And yet you now are in this kind of crazy situation. We have 3 different scales and disciplines, let's say talking about the elevation of the terrain, and you have no way to build an information infrastructure that's smart enough to pick the best available data. And humans can do that and go through, but right now we're at a situation where because the data sources are separate and the traditions are culturally separate, simple stuff like where the building meets the ground, which is pretty important, don't get well recorded and don't get put into GIS operations conventionally. So Bill just walked back in the room. He's done a lot of work on, in his 5th of 400 different useful projects in the world, he's done a lot of work on facilities management integration in GIS. And so I'll credit him with this idea, but there's no reason that the spatial tools that those of us that know GIS are very familiar with can't be equally used inside and outside of buildings, right? It's spatial analysis, to go back to your point. And you know, the reason that some of these tools are applied only in one domain or only on another domain has more to do with professional history than it does with current state of the technology. But there's, of course, incredible value in bridging those. And so I guess back to our group's focus, we were looking for opportunities that are low-hanging fruit or easy opportunities for integration. And traditionally and conventionally, you know, those bottom line issues that are connected to dollars and ongoing headaches or pain points are good opportunities for design and geodesign and BIM integration, for instance, or geodesign and civil. So we could probably come up in another circumstance with a good short list of those. But there are some common things that are done better on the civil side, frankly, that we should just be able to figure out a bridge to get into a geodesign context. Some of the interactive scenario work that's, I think, more developed on the geodesign side would be of great benefit to civil engineers. They would love this stuff. I know that they would, one of their frustrations is
Where the moderator takes over.
Thank
You're
you.
on the next section.
I skipped